I came back from my trip to find my wife in tears, her sobs echoing in the silence of the living room. Still, I didn't move as I noticed my son, David, and his smug in-laws, Paula and Victor, laughing like it was a celebration. The scent of expensive wine hung in the air as their smiles faltered at the sight of me. That's when I realized they thought they could take everything from me, even my home. And now, it was their turn to lose it all. Before the story begins, tell me, where are you watching from? I hope your day's gentle and calm. Please like, subscribe, and let's start our story together. The wheels of Henry Cole's silver sedan crunched against the gravel driveway, carrying with them the quiet fatigue of a man who'd spent 7 days surrounded by spreadsheets, polished handshakes, and hotel coffee that never quite tasted right. The porch light still burned, steady, familiar. A small promise that home was waiting. It had been a week in Dallas, attending a financial seminar for retirees, something to keep his mind sharp even after leaving the bank. At 66, Henry believed in structure. Structure was safety. He opened the front door, suitcase in hand, and immediately froze. Laughter, shrill, overlapping, carefree, filled the house. It wasn't the soft laughter of family catching up. It was the careless laughter of people comfortable in a space that wasn't theirs, his house. The smell of red wine and perfume hit him next. He took a slow step forward, his polished shoes silent against the hardwood. From the hallway, he could see the glow of the chandelier spilling into the living room. Voices overlapped again. "Told you he'd never notice a thing," someone said, followed by the high-pitched giggle of Paula, his daughter-in-law. Henry's pulse quickened, not from anger yet, but from recognition. That tone, smug, unguarded, didn't belong here. He turned the corner. Martha sat on the couch, shoulders slumped, eyes rimmed red. Her hands gripped a crumpled napkin, spotted with tears. The kind woman who'd spent her life tending church flowers and baking pies now looked as though the air had been taken from her. Her gaze darted up to him, a mix of relief and dread. Across from her, sprawled comfortably in his armchairs, sat his son David, his wife Paula, and her parents, Victor and Jeanette Brooks. A bottle of Cabernet stood proudly on the coffee table, half drained. 4 glasses gleamed beside it, 3 full, 1 empty in front of Martha, untouched. Henry didn't speak at first. His silence carried more weight than words could. He studied each of them. David leaned back with the casual arrogance of a man who believed he'd already won some invisible argument. Paula, poised in a white blazer and glittering earrings, smiled as though she were hosting a social event. Victor, broad-shouldered, with his gold watch glinting under the chandelier, smirked faintly, a man used to buying his way through discomfort. It was Paula who finally broke the tension. "Well," she said, swirling her wine, "look who's back. Guess the house feels lighter without the old man." The words landed like shards of glass. Henry set his suitcase down gently by the door. The click of the latch echoed. "Lighter." His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that made rooms pause. "Seems it's heavier with fools." The room went still. Even the laughter, lingering faintly like a ghost in the corners, seemed to die. Martha's lip quivered. Victor shifted in his seat, pretending to adjust his cufflinks. David's smirk faltered, just slightly, but he recovered with a scoff. "Dad, come on," David said, trying for lightness that didn't reach his eyes. "We were just talking. You take everything so seriously." Henry looked at him. The same eyes he'd watched grow from boyhood, now cold, entitled, empty of humility. "Talking?" he repeated. "Then next time, try doing it in your own house." The air was thick with unsaid things. Martha's breathing hitched. She tried to stand, whispering, "Henry, please." But her voice cracked, small and fragile. He walked past them, every step measured, the echo of his shoes a quiet warning. He picked up the empty wine bottle from the table, turned it in his hand, and read the label. "You opened the one from our anniversary," he said softly. Paula crossed her legs. "It was just wine." "Not to her," he replied, setting it back down. His gaze fell on Martha. She couldn't meet his eyes. "Not to me." No one spoke. The clock on the mantel ticked louder than before, each second dragging the silence tighter. Henry turned toward the doorway, then stopped. His tone didn't rise, but the air around him seemed to sharpen. "This house doesn't feel lighter," he said. "It feels polluted." Victor let out a breathy chuckle, trying to defuse the tension. "Now, Henry, no need to get worked up. Family business, that's all." Henry's jaw tightened. "Family," he echoed, the word heavy with contempt. "You mistake the meaning." No one dared answer. He lifted his suitcase again, as if the weight of it might anchor him against the storm forming quietly inside. His eyes passed once more over each face. David, who looked away first. Paula, whose smirk trembled at the edges. Victor and Jeanette, who now avoided his gaze entirely. Finally, his attention landed on Martha. Her hands, small, trembling, clutched that napkin tighter, the tears on it drying into pale stains. She tried to whisper something, but her voice broke before words could form. Henry exhaled slowly. Whatever softness he'd brought back from Dallas, the brief optimism of a man trying to stay relevant, trying to belong, slipped away. He turned toward the hallway, the last light from the chandelier catching on his gray hair. The house was quiet again, but not peaceful. Behind him, the living room that once felt warm now felt foreign, invaded, rearranged, disrespected. And in that silence, the sound of Martha's muffled sobs filled the space where laughter had been. Henry didn't look back, but his hand lingered on the doorknob just long enough for the camera, if there were one, to catch the faint tightening of his jaw, the slow inhale before resolve takes shape. Inside, Martha's fingers clenched around the napkin until it tore. The laughter was gone. The damage wasn't. The night settled heavy over the coal house, pressing against the windows like a weight. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the smell of wet earth still lingered, thick and quiet. Inside, the only sound was the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway, each second stretching the silence between husband and wife. Henry sat at the kitchen table, the same table where he and Martha had once planned birthdays and mortgage payments, where laughter used to fill the gaps between words. Now, only the hum of the refrigerator and Martha's uneven breathing broke the stillness. She stood near the counter, wringing her hands with a napkin already twisted out of shape. Her eyes were puffy, the faint red still visible from earlier tears. When she finally spoke, her voice came out thin, trembling at the edges. "They brought a realtor while you were away." Henry's head lifted slowly. He didn't blink. The words hung in the air, too absurd to belong to reality. "A realtor?" His tone wasn't loud, but it carried the sharp edge of disbelief. Martha nodded, eyes glistening. "They said, it's better if the house is under David's name now. Something about simplifying inheritance, protecting assets." She swallowed hard. "They made it sound reasonable. They said you'd already discussed it before you left." Henry leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him. He stared at the wall for a moment, as though the pattern of the wallpaper might make sense of what he'd just heard. Then he exhaled through his nose, slow, measured, the way he used to before turning down a risky loan at the bank. "They said that, did they?" Martha moved to the table, trembling hands clutching a manila envelope. She laid it down carefully, as though afraid it might explode. "I didn't sign anything," she said quickly, her voice cracking. "I didn't understand most of it, but they said it was just a formality, that you'd—" Henry slid the papers out of the envelope. The overhead light caught the faint shimmer of embossed letterhead, the name of the same bank he'd managed for 30 years. The sight alone tightened something inside him. He flipped through the pages one by one, his eyes narrowing. A transfer deed, property reassignment, and there. His own name scrawled neatly at the bottom. His signature, except it wasn't. The curve of the H was too smooth. The C lacked the small upward tick he'd always made out of habit. Whoever forged it had been clever, careful, but not enough to fool a man who'd spent decades reading the fine print of human deceit. He looked up, eyes cold. "My signature." Martha flinched at his tone. "I didn't know, Henry. I swear I didn't. They said you'd already agreed over the phone. David looked so sure. Paula, she laughed when I asked questions." Henry set the papers down gently, aligning their edges like he was closing a transaction. The habit never left him. Even in anger, he stayed precise. "You trusted them," he said, not as accusation but as truth. "You thought because they were family, they wouldn't cross that line." Martha's shoulders sagged, her voice barely a whisper. "He's our son." "Was," Henry murmured, almost to himself. The clock ticked louder. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked with the sound of age. He stood slowly, his chair scraping against the tile. He picked up the deed again, studying the forged signature like it was a personal insult. "They said I'd agreed?" Martha nodded, guilt and fear tangled in her eyes. "Yes, they said you'd already given verbal consent to Victor. They had a banker confirm the papers were in motion. I didn't know what to believe." Henry's jaw tightened. The world around him seemed to narrow. Just him, the papers, and the echo of his own name written by another man's hand. He folded the documents back into the envelope, slid them across the table, and placed his palm on them. His wedding ring tapped once against the paper, a hollow sound. "They forged a banker's signature, my signature, on my house." Martha nodded silently. Tears slid down her cheeks again. He didn't shout, didn't pace, didn't curse. That wasn't Henry Cole. His anger was a colder thing, something that calcified instead of burned. Finally, he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then they're about to meet the man they think I'm not." The line cut through the room like a blade. Martha froze, her tears stilled by the tone in his voice. Low, controlled, dangerous in its calm. She'd seen him angry before, but never like this. This wasn't the anger of a husband wronged. It was the quiet precision of a man who'd spent his life turning chaos into order, now turning that same discipline toward vengeance. Henry walked to the living room window and looked out at the dark street. The reflection of his face stared back, older, colder, sharper. He pressed one hand to the glass, the other holding the envelope. Behind him, Martha whispered, "Henry, what are you going to do?" He didn't answer. Outside, a car passed, its headlights flashing briefly across the window. The moment they faded, the room returned to shadow. Henry stood there, still as stone, the faint rustle of paper in his hand, the only sound left. Morning light broke pale and cold over Charlotte, the kind of light that doesn't warm, just exposes. Henry dressed the same way he always did. Crisp shirt, navy blazer, polished shoes. Though inside, his calm had edges now. His movements were methodical, ritualistic. He had spent decades walking into bank branches like this one with pride. Today, he walked in with purpose. The glass doors slid open to the soft chime of entry. The familiar scent of toner, paper, and coffee lingered in the air, the smell of his former world. He used to run this branch, or one just like it. Now, a younger face sat behind the frosted glass office that used to be his. "Mr. Cole?" The woman's voice carried a professional brightness. She was maybe in her late 30s, dark suit, steady smile, nameplate reading Melissa Harper, branch manager. Henry nodded politely, shaking her hand. "Thank you for seeing me on short notice." "Of course," she said. "When you mentioned your concern over a property transaction, I wanted to make sure we looked into it right away." She gestured for him to sit, then closed the office door. The faint hum of printers filled the silence as she pulled up files on her computer. Henry folded his hands on the desk, every inch the gentleman banker he'd always been. But behind his eyes, calculation had already begun. Melissa turned the screen toward him. "Here it is," she said. "A mortgage consolidation request filed 3 days ago." Henry leaned forward. The document filled the monitor, the property address, his own. Borrower, David Cole. Cosigner, Henry Cole. His jaw tightened slightly. Melissa scrolled down, unaware of the slow fury tightening in his chest. "Everything looks properly formatted," she continued, "except—" She paused, leaning closer to the screen. "This signature. It's digital, time-stamped from an IP address not registered under your name." Henry stared at the signature, his name typed, stylized, precise enough to fool most, but not him. Never him. He straightened, the calm of a man who'd already recognized the full scope of the insult. "That's not mine," he said quietly. Melissa's expression shifted. I thought as much. You were listed as co-signer on a consolidation that would have moved your home's equity into your son's account. That kind of transaction requires in-person verification. Henry nodded once. His voice stayed even. Who initiated it? She hesitated. David Cole, yes, but his file was expedited internally. There's an executive override code on it. That only happens when someone from the board sponsors the application. Henry's gaze sharpened. And who would that be? She lowered her voice. Victor Brooks, Real Estate Division. He's on the board advisory committee now. Henry didn't move, didn't blink. The world around him, the chatter of tellers, the rustle of deposit slips, seemed to fade. He could almost hear the laughter from his living room again, mocking, careless. Melissa watched him carefully. Mr. Cole, if you'd like, we can open a fraud investigation. He raised a hand slightly. Not yet. His voice was quiet but firm. May I speak to someone from document processing? Someone who was here when this came through? She hesitated, then pressed a button on her phone. Diane, can you step in for a moment? The door opened, and a woman in her 50s entered. Silver hair, familiar eyes. Mr. Cole, she said softly, surprised. It's been a long time. Henry smiled faintly. Too long, Diane. She'd been his assistant once, loyal, sharp, the kind of employee who noticed everything. Melissa explained briefly, then excused herself to take a call. The moment the door shut, Diane leaned in. I saw the file come through, she whispered. Didn't think much at first, but when I saw your name, I checked the timestamp. Henry's eyes met hers. And it was uploaded from an external server, off-site, signature added digitally. IP traces back to a company registered under Victor Brooks's firm. Her voice dropped even lower. Henry, Paula's father has friends on the board. That's how they pushed this through, quietly. Henry nodded once. The calm returned, deliberate and deadly. You've always had a good eye for detail, Diane. She smiled sadly. And you always had a good sense for storms before they hit. He placed a hand on her shoulder, gratitude without words, then gathered his papers, sliding them neatly into his leather briefcase. Melissa returned as he stood. Mr. Cole, we can escalate this to compliance if you'd like. He offered a polite smile, buttoning his blazer. Not yet. You've been more helpful than you know. He shook her hand once more, then walked out of the branch, each step slow, measured, echoing against the marble floor. Outside, the morning had turned bright, too bright. He walked to his car, the crisp air slicing clean against his skin. He opened the driver's door, set his briefcase on the passenger seat, and sat for a long moment. The bank loomed behind him in the rearview mirror, the same world he'd helped build, now being used to betray him. His reflection in the glass looked older somehow, but not weaker. He exhaled, eyes narrowing. I taught them finance, he murmured, voice cold as the metal around him. Now they'll learn consequence. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. The engine started with a low growl. The next evening, the Cole house looked almost normal again, lamps glowing soft amber, Martha's roast chicken scent drifting through the air, the dining table set for 6. To any passerby, it might have seemed like a peaceful family gathering. But to Henry, it was the calm before a storm he'd already decided to unleash. He'd called earlier that morning, his tone even, his invitation brief. Dinner, 7 o'clock, everyone. No explanations. No arguments. Now, as he stood in the doorway between the kitchen and dining room, he could feel the tension before anyone even spoke. Martha moved quietly beside him, her hands restless with nervous energy. She had asked him, twice, if this was a good idea. He hadn't answered either time. The first to arrive was David, swaggering in with the casual confidence of a man who believed his father had already surrendered. Dad, he said, slapping Henry lightly on the shoulder, not another lecture about fiscal discipline, I hope. Paula says she's still traumatized from your last one. Henry smiled faintly, polite, restrained. Just dinner tonight, son. Paula followed, perfume thick in the air, a smirk tugging at her lips. Behind them came Victor and Jeanette Brooks. dressed as though they were attending a cocktail reception instead of a family meal. Victor wore that same smug, easy confidence, the air of a man who believed influence outweighed integrity. They settled around the table. Martha served in silence, her eyes darting between her husband and son like she was waiting for a spark to catch. David poured himself wine. "So, Dad, what's the occasion? We celebrating the seminar or retirement? Again?" Henry waited until the plates were full, until the room had found its rhythm of clinking cutlery and surface-level conversation. Then he reached under his chair and placed a manila envelope on the table, the same one that had sat on his desk since the bank visit. "Before we eat," he said quietly, "I'd like to discuss something." David glanced at Paula, rolling his eyes. "Here it comes." Henry slid the envelope across the table. "You tried to sell my home while I was alive." The words landed heavy, flattening the room into silence. Martha's fork fell against her plate with a sharp clang. Paula's expression flickered, her composure slipping for just a second before she crossed her arms and leaned back. Victor, unbothered, chuckled. "Now, Henry, let's not dramatize. It's not selling your home. It's a simple transfer of ownership. Technically," he added with that polished arrogance, "it's your son's future asset." Henry looked at him, eyes calm but cutting. "Then that future ends tonight." The sentence was soft, but it carried the kind of authority that made men like Victor shift in their seats. David forced a laugh, his fork pausing mid-air. "You're taking this too seriously. It's just paperwork, Dad. You've always said property should move down generations." "I said inheritance should be earned," Henry replied, "not stolen." Paula leaned forward. "Oh, come on. No one's stealing anything. We were just trying to protect the family estate from unnecessary taxes. You'd know about that, being a banker." Her tone dripped with practiced charm, but her hands betrayed her, fingers fidgeting against the napkin in her lap. Henry turned his gaze toward her, steady and unblinking. "I know enough to recognize fraud when I see it, and I know which signatures are mine." David's chair creaked as he leaned back, trying to smile, but his voice carried a tremor now. "Dad, listen, Victor said—" "I don't care what Victor said," Henry interrupted, still calm. "You let him turn my home into a business transaction. You let greed speak louder than respect." Victor's smirk faltered. "Now hold on, Henry. You're not exactly innocent here. You built your life on contracts and loopholes. Don't act like you're above strategy." Henry stood, his chair sliding back just slightly, the sound deliberate. "Strategy builds. Fraud destroys. You don't know the difference because you've never had to live with consequences." The room was silent again, except for the faint ticking of the clock on the mantel. Martha's eyes brimmed with tears, but Henry didn't look at her. His focus was on the 4 people sitting across from him, the people who'd turned his absence into opportunity. He gathered the papers from the envelope, holding them in one hand. "This," he said, lifting the forged deed, "isn't a mistake. It's intent, and intent has a cost." David started to speak, but Henry raised a hand. "No more talk tonight. I wanted to see all your faces when I said this out loud, so you'd remember it." He placed the papers neatly back into the envelope, tucked it under his arm, and straightened his jacket. "Dinner's over." He turned toward the hallway, the wooden floor creaking under his steps. "Dad, wait," David called, his voice breaking the silence. "You're not really going to—" Henry paused at the threshold, not looking back. "You tried to take everything from me," he said quietly. "All I'm doing is returning the favor." The air seemed to thicken as he stepped out of the room. Martha sat frozen, tears slipping down her cheeks. Paula's jaw clenched. Victor stared after Henry, his smirk gone, replaced by something closer to unease. From the doorway, Henry's voice came one last time, steady, almost calm again. "Enjoy your meal. It's the last thing you'll have in this house." Then he left. The sound of the front door closing was soft but final, the kind of sound that carries more threat than shouting ever could. Inside, the 4 of them sat in silence, the untouched plates steaming between them. And somewhere down the hall, Martha whispered a prayer under her breath, her eyes fixed on the door, the one Henry had just walked through, eyes cold, mind already moving towards something calculated. The moon was low, casting a pale silver glow over the porch, as if the night itself had been drained of color. A light breeze stirred the air, but it did nothing to cool the heat of the anger that still simmered in Henry's chest. He had gone inside after dinner, walked past the empty plates, the strained silence of a family shattered. But Martha had stayed behind, the weight of everything sinking in. Outside, she sat on the weathered porch swing, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The wooden boards creaked under her weight, the soft motion of the swing almost mechanical, as though she were trying to escape the storm in her mind, but couldn't. The night was quiet, too quiet, except for the distant hum of traffic on the other side of the neighborhood. Henry stepped out quietly, the screen door rattling behind him as he approached. He didn't know what to say. She was the kind of woman who wore her pain like a mantle, never heavy, always humble. But now her grief spilled over, unmistakable. Her shoulders shook with the quiet sobs that had begun to escape her, her face buried in her hands, her breaths ragged and shallow. He stood in the shadows of the porch, watching her, the moonlight stretching long across the yard, just far enough to keep him at a distance. He couldn't help himself. His heart ached for her, but it ached more for what was already lost, for the son they had raised, for the betrayal that had already been set in motion. He had already known the fight was coming, but seeing Martha like this, broken and helpless, was a different kind of pain. "Martha," he said, his voice low, the sound of her name more of a question than a comfort. She didn't look up. Her hands trembled, wiping the wetness from her face, trying to pull herself together, as though the act of doing so could undo everything that had just happened. The house, the deception, David's empty promises. It was all unraveling, and Henry knew, deep down, it would never be the same. "We raised him right, Henry, didn't we?" Her voice broke on the last word, the tremor of doubt slipping through the cracks of her composed exterior. Henry took a step forward, his boots quiet on the porch's weathered wood, and crouched down beside her. He reached out, resting a hand on her shoulder, but his touch was firm, not tender. There was something about this moment, something about the sadness in her question, that stirred something colder inside him. "We raised him soft," he answered, his voice soft but steady. The words came without thought, as though they had been waiting to be said for years. He never learned the value of struggle, of consequence, always protected, always told that the world owed him something. He paused, swallowing against the dryness in his throat. Now he's trying to take what doesn't belong to him. Martha sniffled, wiping her eyes again with the back of her hand, but the tears still came. "Please, Henry," she whispered, the rawness in her voice cutting through him. "Let it go. Let them have the house. We don't need all this fighting. It's not worth it. We've had enough." Henry's expression softened, but only for a moment. He leaned in, brushing her hair away from her face gently, pressing his lips to her forehead in the way he always had when things felt too heavy. It was a familiar gesture, one that usually brought comfort, but tonight there was no solace in it for him. "No, love," he said softly, his lips brushing against her skin. "I'll let it cost." His words were a quiet promise, a decision that had already been made. The weight of it settled into the space between them. Martha looked up, her tear-streaked face pale in the moonlight. Her eyes searched his, as if she were trying to find the man she had married beneath the quiet storm of his words. She had always known Henry as a man of patience, of quiet wisdom, but this was different. She could feel the shift in him, the hardening. It scared her. It scared her more than the thought of losing the house, more than any of the betrayal she had just witnessed. "Henry," she whispered, voice shaking, "please, don't lose yourself in this." His eyes softened for just a moment, but then the storm came again. "I haven't lost myself," he said, his voice steady. "But they'll learn what happens when you push a man too far." He stood, offering her a hand that she didn't take. Instead, she stayed seated, watching him with a mixture of fear and sorrow in her eyes. The porch swing creaked again, the sound of it almost drowning out the quiet tension between them. Henry turned slowly, not looking back. He knew the choice he had made, and there was no turning back now. As he walked inside, his footsteps slow, measured, he paused in the hallway just outside the door to his home office. The door was slightly ajar, the light from his desk lamp spilling into the dark hallway. It was an ordinary office, filled with old files and books, but tonight it felt colder, more impersonal. The file cabinet in the corner glowed faintly in the lamplight, its contents hidden behind a locked door. A door that, tonight, felt like the threshold to everything that was about to unfold. Henry stood there for a moment, his hand resting against the doorframe, and the thought came to him again. Revenge begins in silence. He walked into the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The sound echoed, and in the stillness, the plan that had been set into motion would unfold. The office was quiet, save for the sound of a ceiling fan slowly turning above. Dust particles floated in the shafts of light, spilling through the blinds. The weight of old wood and leather carried the scent of a lifetime spent in service of the law. Franklin Reese's office had been the same for as long as Henry could remember. The same dark mahogany desk, the same heavy leather chairs, the same worn carpet that seemed to have absorbed decades of stress and tension. It was the kind of place that made you feel like the world's problems could be solved here, if only you waited long enough. Henry stepped in, his polished shoes muffled against the thick carpet. Franklin rose from behind his desk, his face a study of quiet acknowledgement. A moment of recognition passed between them. Two old friends, now bound by a weighty silence, neither was willing to break just yet. They had seen each other through different lives, different battles, but today, the weight on Henry's shoulders was one he knew Franklin could understand. "Henry," Franklin said, his voice low, calm. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. "It's good to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." Henry sat down, placing a manila folder in front of Franklin. His hand lingered on the edge, fingertips brushing the papers inside, as if the weight of what they held could still be avoided. He pushed the folder gently toward his friend. "I need your help," he said, his voice steady but edged with something more, something cold. Franklin didn't immediately open the folder. Instead, he looked at Henry, his eyes searching, as though he already knew what this was about. His expression tightened slightly, but he didn't ask. He simply nodded, reached for the folder, and opened it. Inside, the documents were neatly arranged, a series of bank papers, signatures, and deeds. But it wasn't the neatness that struck Franklin. It was the unmistakable, forged signature on the transfer deed, Henry's own name, written by someone else's hand. "Jesus, Henry," Franklin muttered, his brow furrowing as he flipped through the pages. "This isn't just sloppy, this is deliberate. Your son, and Victor Brooks, I assume." Henry nodded, his jaw tight. "David and his in-laws. They've been planning this for months. Moving everything behind my back, trying to strip me of the house while I was away. They thought I wouldn't catch on." Franklin leaned back in his chair, eyes scanning the papers, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. "This isn't just a legal matter, Henry. This is personal. They've overstepped." Henry's gaze didn't leave the documents in Franklin's hands. "I know. That's why I'm here." He paused, then added quietly, "I'm done being the man who waits for things to fall apart." Franklin exhaled slowly, his lips pursed. "So, what do you want to do?" Henry's answer came without hesitation. "I want them to pay, but I want it to hurt more than just a slap on the wrist. I want them to understand the cost of crossing me." Franklin studied him for a moment, and then leaned forward, his tone measured. "You want police or patience?" The question hung in the air, thick with implications. It was the moment of choice, the moment where everything could spiral into chaos, or where precision could take the lead. "Patience," Henry replied quietly. His voice had softened, but it held an underlying strength, the quiet, determined strength of a man who had already mapped out his next move. "Police come second." Franklin's eyes narrowed slightly as he processed the weight of Henry's words. He leaned back again, considering. "All right, so we do this your way. No public mess, no scandal. We go slow. We freeze their assets, document every move they make. We'll hit them where it hurts, without them ever realizing it's coming. Henry didn't smile, but his eyes sharpened. Exactly. And when they finally realize what's happening, it'll be too late to stop it. Franklin reached for a pen, scribbling down notes on a legal pad, his movements quick and practiced. I'll get the necessary paperwork for asset freezes. We'll go after the properties they've been trying to move, and I'll start collecting the right contacts at the bank to get access to the records. Everything they've done, it'll be documented. This is going to take time, but it'll be airtight when it's done. Henry's expression never changed, but something in his posture shifted. The tension in his shoulders eased ever so slightly. He trusted Franklin, but more than that, he trusted the methodical precision that Franklin always brought to the table. There was no rush, no loud moves. This was about cold, calculated revenge, and Henry had waited long enough. I'll start moving my savings into a trust, Henry said, voice low. Safer that way. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate. The plan was taking shape, and with each passing moment, the sting of betrayal dulled into something else, something colder, sharper. Franklin nodded. I'll take care of the rest. You know where to reach me. As Henry turned to leave, the door clicking softly behind him, he felt the weight of the last few days lift, even if only slightly. Martha didn't know what he was planning, and he intended to keep it that way. It was safer that way, for her and for him. He couldn't afford to let her see the man he had become, the man who was about to make David and Victor pay for their arrogance. The night was waiting for him outside, the dark sky stretching endlessly above. And in the quiet, Henry could almost hear the ticking of the clock, a reminder that revenge, like everything else, takes time. The phone rang at precisely 10:32 a.m. The ring echoed through the quiet of the house, sharp and intrusive. Henry knew it was coming. The call was almost inevitable. He picked up the receiver, his voice steady, a practiced calmness hiding the tightness in his chest. Henry Cole. On the other end, a woman's voice, young, polite, and far too casual for the gravity of the situation. Mr. Cole, this is Emily Roberts, from Walker & Sons Realty. We're finalizing the pre-sale appraisal for your property. Henry felt his grip tighten on the phone, but his voice didn't waver. Pre-sale appraisal? He paused, just long enough to make her feel the weight of his words. I wasn't aware there was an agreement to sell. There was a brief silence, the kind that always comes when someone is caught in a lie. Well, Mr. Cole, Emily continued, this is just a formality. As we discussed earlier, your son and his family are planning to move forward with the sale. We're simply completing the necessary paperwork. Henry's jaw clenched. David, again trying to pull strings behind his back, pretending the house was already gone. He played along, his mind calculating the next steps, his face unreadable. And when is the appraisal scheduled? Tomorrow at 2 p.m., Emily said, her voice chirping with a forced cheerfulness. We'll have the buyers in, and everything should be finalized soon after. Henry's heart pounded in his chest, but his face remained still. Tomorrow, he thought. Just one more day. He thanked her, hung up the phone and sat for a moment, allowing the tension to settle into his bones. He'd played the part. Now it was time to prepare. The house had been silent since the call, the weight of the betrayal lingering in every corner. Martha had been upstairs when the phone rang, but she came down just as Henry moved to his office, opening the door with a soft creak. She stood in the doorway, arms crossed tightly against her chest. Her face was pale, but there was something steely in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. Henry, she said, her voice trembling just slightly, you're not really letting them sell, are you? Henry didn't turn to face her. He was already focused on the desk in front of him, methodically pulling out documents from a drawer, sorting through receipts, photos, and ownership records. The house was his, but he needed the proof, the evidence. Nothing could be left to chance. No, he said, his voice quiet but cold. I'm letting them perform. Martha stepped further into the room, her voice thick with concern. Henry, this isn't like you. You're not some villain in a story. We've always been above this. She paused, a tremor running through her words. Are you really going to go through with it? Let them think they've won? Henry stood up from the desk, papers in hand, and turned to face her for the first time since she entered the room. His expression was set, resolute. They won't think they've won, Martha. I'll make sure of it. She opened her mouth to say something else, but he stopped her with a single glance. His eyes were calm, calculating, a stark contrast to the storm that brewed in his chest. He was already 2 steps ahead, already playing the game, and she was caught in the ripples. The thunder rumbled in the distance, the sound deep and ominous. Outside, the clouds were gathering, dark and heavy, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Henry could feel the pressure, a slow build of anticipation, like the first crack of thunder before the storm broke wide open. He moved past Martha, his footsteps measured, deliberate. The door to his office closed with a soft click behind him. The house felt even quieter now, the weight of the situation settling over them both. He gathered the last of the papers, the photographs of the home's original deeds, his insurance documents, anything that could prove ownership. He wasn't just going to stop them, he was going to make them regret ever thinking they could take what wasn't theirs. He moved toward the back door of the house, the one that led into the backyard. There, he had set up a small makeshift office, the beginnings of a new strategy. A locked file cabinet stood in the corner, its contents still fresh from last night's planning. He hadn't yet told Martha about it. She didn't need to know, not yet. The storm outside raged louder now, the wind beginning to howl as the first drops of rain began to fall. The sound of the thunder mirrored the tension inside Henry. The storm was coming, and he was ready. He paused at the window, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the dark clouds met the earth. His face, normally composed, was now set in a determined grimace. Tomorrow, he whispered to himself, voice low and almost drowned out by the rumble of the storm. Let them think they've won. Let them think they can take everything. Tomorrow, I'll make sure they know what happens when they push a man too far. As the thunder cracked louder, the room seemed to close in around him. He could feel the storm building, not just outside, but inside him too. And when it broke, when the storm hit its peak, he would be ready. The house sat still, bathed in the harsh afternoon light, the kind that cuts through everything, stripping the world of its warmth and leaving only the cold outlines of reality. The driveway, usually empty at this hour, was now full. 2 cars, one sleek and black, the other a weathered sedan, were parked in front. Through the windows, Henry could see figures moving about, the soft shuffle of footsteps, the murmur of polite conversation. He stopped at the edge of the driveway, just before stepping onto the walkway leading to his front door. He stood for a moment, taking in the sight of his own home, being turned into an exhibit, a thing for sale. His house, his life, reduced to a commodity. As Henry stepped onto the porch, the door swung open. Paula stood there, her smile wide, but too wide, too practiced, like it had been rehearsed. Dad, we're just exploring options, she said, her tone too bright to match the weight of the situation. Henry's gaze shifted past her to the living room, where strangers walked across the polished floors, glancing around at the furniture, like it was something they could touch, take, own. They'll never understand, he thought, his hands curling into fists. He couldn't stop the cold wave of anger that hit him, not just at Paula, but at the entire charade. Paula stepped aside, ushering him in with exaggerated politeness. I thought you'd be pleased, Dad. This is a good step for the family, you know. She shot a quick glance at the group of potential buyers milling around in the living room, the perfect picture of a transaction, a deal waiting to be signed. Henry didn't reply. His eyes were already scanning the room, taking in every detail. There was Victor, standing off to the side, speaking in low tones to one of the buyers. His smile was smooth, too smooth, a practiced grin that had always come too easily to him. It was as if he thought Henry was already out of the picture. He knew exactly what was happening. Ownership will be seamless, Victor was saying, his voice rich with authority, as if it were already decided. The buyers nodded, eager to agree, eager to move forward. Henry's heart pounded, but his face remained still, unreadable. He knew this game. knew exactly how to play it. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase, pulling out the very documents that had started this entire mess. The forged deed, the transfer of ownership, the lies that had been stitched together by people he had once trusted. The papers felt heavy in his hands, their weight a reminder of everything that had been taken from him. He stepped forward, walking slowly into the room. The noise of the buyers, their excited chatter, faded as he moved through the space. He opened the document, holding it up for everyone to see, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Ownership already is seamless," he said, his voice low but firm, "because it never left me." For a brief moment, no one spoke. The buyers stood frozen, their faces shifting between confusion and disbelief. The realtor, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp features and a sharp suit, looked between the document and Henry, her eyes wide. Victor's expression faltered, just for a split second. The smirk that had been so sure on his face disappeared, replaced by a flash of panic. "Henry, I don't need your excuses, Victor," Henry interrupted, his tone calm but cutting. "I don't need your lies." The buyers exchanged uncertain glances, their excitement evaporating as the weight of the situation settled over the room. The realtor took a small step back, her professionalism crumbling in the face of a reality she wasn't prepared for. Henry stood tall, his posture unwavering. "You can all leave now. I'll see you in court, or you'll see yourselves out. Your choice." There was a moment of silence, thick and suffocating, where no one moved. The air seemed to stand still, caught between the past and the future, between the life Henry had built and the one David and Victor had tried to steal from him. Victor opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The words he had prepared, the smooth lies he had crafted to make this all go away, died in his throat. Finally, the realtor turned to the buyers, her face pale, and without a word, she gestured for them to follow her. The potential buyers filed out of the room, looking back only once at Henry, their faces unreadable, but no longer full of hope. Henry didn't watch them leave. His gaze stayed fixed on Victor, who now stood motionless, his face a mixture of shock and anger. As the last of the buyers slipped out of the front door, Henry turned slowly, his face unreadable, and walked toward the exit. Victor's voice finally broke the silence. "You'll regret this, Henry. You're making a mistake." Henry stopped, his back still to him. "No, Victor," he said quietly without turning. "You already have." With that, he stepped outside, the door closing softly behind him. The house was quiet again, the tension still lingering in the air, heavy and thick. But for Henry, it was a different kind of silence now, one where he finally held the upper hand. The door to Henry's office slammed open with such force that the frame rattled. The sound echoed through the quiet of the house, disrupting the stillness. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't even look up. He had been waiting for this. David stood in the doorway, his face flushed, eyes wide with the kind of rage that only comes from humiliation. His jaw was clenched so tightly that his teeth ground against each other. "You embarrassed me in front of them," he spat, the words coming out like venom. Henry didn't move. His fingers remained steady on the papers in front of him, the documents he had been reviewing, receipts, photos, ownership records. His eyes remained fixed on them, as if they were the only thing that mattered in the room. The weight of the moment was heavy, but it wasn't in his posture. It wasn't in his movements. It was in the space between them. "No," Henry said, his voice calm even. "You embarrassed yourself." David's chest heaved with anger, his face contorting as though Henry's words were a physical blow. He stormed into the room, pacing in front of Henry's desk, his movements erratic. "You don't get it, do you? You're ruining everything. That house, Dad, that's my future." Henry's eyes lifted from the papers, finally meeting David's gaze. His face was composed, unreadable, but beneath the surface, there was a quiet storm of anger and disappointment. "That house was never yours to take," he said softly, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "It was mine, and you tried to steal it." David took a step back, his chest rising and falling rapidly as he absorbed the weight of his father's words. For a brief moment, the anger flickered in his eyes, replaced by something darker, something more dangerous. "You're making a mistake, old man," he said, his voice low and threatening. "If you don't stop, I'll cut you out. I'll cut all of you out of my life. You'll never see me again." Henry's gaze never wavered. "You think I care?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truth. The truth that Henry had known for years. His son was too entitled, too soft, to see what truly mattered. All his life, Henry had built a foundation, stone by stone, brick by brick, and David had tried to tear it down with a single, reckless stroke. David's voice broke the silence again, this time a harsh, strangled shout. "That house should have been mine. You promised. You said it would be mine when you were gone. I've done everything you asked. But you couldn't even trust me to handle that. All I've ever wanted was for you to let go and let me have it." Henry leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. He didn't rise to David's anger. He didn't need to. The storm was on the other side of the desk, and Henry knew it would pass. "Earn it then," he said quietly. "The house, the legacy, the respect. Earn it." David froze, the words landing like a slap, cutting deeper than any insult Henry had ever thrown at him. For a brief second, there was a flicker of doubt in his son's eyes, a flicker of recognition that what he had been chasing wasn't just a house, but the respect he had never truly earned. But that recognition was brief, lost to the surge of rage that followed. David's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. "You're nothing but a stubborn old man, Henry. A fool." Without another word, David spun on his heel and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him with a fury that rattled the walls. The sound echoed in the silence that followed, a final punctuation to the argument. Henry sat still, the air around him thick with the weight of the exchange. His fingers slowly traced the edge of the desk, his thoughts moving behind his steady expression. The camera would linger here, on Henry's face. No signs of emotion, but the quiet determination in his eyes was unmistakable. His jaw was set, his posture calm, but beneath the surface, the line had been drawn. David had made his threat, and Henry had answered with something far more powerful than anger, with control. The line between them had shifted. David would never understand what Henry was capable of, but that was no longer Henry's problem. He stood slowly, his hands moving to close the folder in front of him, the finality of the gesture marking the end of a chapter. The storm outside continued to rage, its distant rumble growing louder, but inside the house, the air had changed. Henry's mind was already moving to the next step, the next phase of this slow, deliberate dance. The storm would pass, just like David's fury would, and when it did, Henry would be waiting. The Brooks' New Year's Eve party was a spectacle, the kind of event that could have been staged in a movie. The sprawling estate, the soft glow of chandeliers, the clinking of glasses, the smooth hum of idle chatter. Inside, guests in formal wear moved in groups, exchanging laughter, stories, and subtle glances. On the surface, it was an evening of luxury, of things that people like the Brookses had worked so hard to accumulate. But beneath the polished surface, there was something darker lurking, an undercurrent of whispered rumors and half-spoken truths. Henry knew about the party. It was hard not to, given how much of the neighborhood was buzzing with talk. They were all gathered, the usual faces, the ones who flaunted their wealth and success. There was no subtlety here, just a crowd hungry for gossip and status. What surprised Henry was the way they talked about him now. The man who had always stood a little taller, the one who had built everything on integrity, was now the subject of hushed conversations and knowing looks. As he sat in the quiet of his living room, Henry could hear the faint music from the Brooks' estate through the night air. He wasn't going. He wasn't about to walk into that house full of people who saw his downfall as entertainment. No, tonight wasn't for him. But he wasn't blind to the rumors swirling around. At the heart of it all was the whisper, "Henry Cole lost his home." The phrase wasn't exactly a lie, not in its simplest form, but it was far from the truth. He had never lost his home. It was being taken from him, but he hadn't given up. Not yet. Meanwhile, across the street, Franklin Reese made his entrance into the lavish party, dressed in a dark suit, looking every bit the part of the smooth-talking, high-powered attorney he was. But his eyes were calculating, A little too observant, a little too careful. He wasn't here for the champagne or the small talk. Franklin had come for something much more valuable, information. He didn't immediately make his presence known, sidling into the crowd with the ease of a man who'd spent his life in rooms like this. He moved through the throng, shaking hands, exchanging pleasantries, all the while pretending to drink from his glass, his mind fixed on the task at hand. He was gathering, quietly, methodically. Across the room, a small group of guests stood by the fireplace, their voices rising just a little too much for comfort. One man, a tall figure with a thick mustache and a too-wide smile, was speaking louder than the rest. "Victor's got the Cole property locked down," the man said, puffing out his chest. "You know, the old man never even saw it coming. It's practically a done deal, one of those insider connections, a smooth transfer, all quiet-like." Franklin's eyes narrowed. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass, and his expression didn't shift, but the wheels in his head were already turning. He had expected this. He had known Victor Brooks would be slick, that he'd find a way to move the property in silence, behind closed doors. But hearing it confirmed out loud, hearing it in such a casual, arrogant tone, made the truth settle in his stomach like a stone. Franklin stepped closer. Just enough to catch the conversation, all while keeping his distance, letting the others carry on with their chatter. He didn't want to raise suspicion. With the skill of a man who had seen enough to know when something was worth recording, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Without a glance at the screen, he started recording, capturing every word of the conversation. Victor's name, the mention of a smooth transfer, the unmistakable confidence of people who thought they had already won. The sound of laughter grew louder, and Franklin's gaze remained steady. He wasn't here to make noise. He was here to gather the kind of evidence that would turn the tables when the time came. It wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about exposing everything, the lies, the manipulation, the greed. Outside, Henry was in his car, driving past the Brookses' estate slowly. He didn't want to be seen, not yet. The flickering lights of the grand house reflected in his rearview mirror, a reminder of everything that had been taken from him. The music spilled into the night air, an almost mocking reminder of the party, the celebration that wasn't meant for him. His grip tightened on the steering wheel, his eyes locked on the lights in the distance. For a moment, the weight of everything that had happened, the betrayal, the humiliation, pressed against his chest like a vice. But then the thought came to him, sharp and clear. He was still in control. He would not be swept away by the storm. He would make them pay for this, every last one of them. "Every kingdom falls under its own laughter," he murmured under his breath, almost to himself. It was the same thought that had haunted him all night. The world, the ones who thought they could take from him, would soon see what happened when a kingdom began to crumble. And when it did, it would be the laughter that haunted them, not him. As he drove past, the lights faded into the distance, but the storm inside him only grew. He wasn't done. Not yet. The game had only just begun. The phone call was simple, a conversation that Henry had been planning in his head for days. He sat alone in his study, the room dimly lit by the low golden glow of his desk lamp. He didn't need anyone's approval to make the call. He had spent a lifetime building relationships with people who could make things happen, and this was just another step in a long game. He picked up the phone and dialed the number of a former contact at the bank, a man named Arthur Griggs, who now worked in the state office's financial oversight division. "Arthur," Henry greeted when the line picked up. "It's Henry Cole. I need a favor." Arthur's voice was warm with recognition. "Henry, long time. What's going on? You need something for the old bank accounts?" Henry smiled faintly, but there was no mirth in it. "Something like that," he said. "I need an audit, a state-level audit of some property transfers, specifically some recent deals that were made by Victor Brooks and his family." There was a pause on the other end. Arthur wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but the request itself was enough to make him hesitate. "You sure about this, Henry? You know, when you dig into someone like Brooks, it might get messy." Henry leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the weight of his words. "I'm sure. There's been too much silence, too much underhanded maneuvering. I want everything they've done laid bare." Arthur finally agreed, his voice filled with resignation. "All right, I'll get my team on it. You'll have the reports in a few days." That was it. The call ended with no fanfare, but the wheels had been set in motion. Henry sat back, his fingers tapping lightly on the desk. He could already picture the outcome, a slow, methodical unraveling of everything Victor and his family had built, every deal they'd made in the dark. The following days moved quickly. Investigators dove into the paperwork, pulling at threads that Henry had known existed but hadn't yet proved. By the time Franklin Reese met with him in the small conference room of his office, the truth was starting to take shape. Franklin had brought a stack of printed documents, each one a piece of the puzzle. He laid them on the table in front of Henry, his face grim. "3 properties under the Brooks name," Franklin began, "all with irregular cosigners. But that's not all. The signatures don't match up, Henry. The cosigners weren't even aware they were on the paperwork. It's a clear pattern of fraudulent activity." Henry's eyes didn't leave the papers, his fingers brushing over the names and figures, tracing the flow of the transactions. He had known something like this was coming, but seeing it in black and white still sent a cold shiver through him. His son-in-law, Victor, had been operating under the assumption that Henry would never notice, that the quiet man he thought he could control would simply let it go. "Your son-in-law's fraud wasn't his first," Franklin added, his tone low but assured. "We found similar irregularities with 2 other deals dating back several years. If we bring this to light, the repercussions won't just be legal. This could destroy the Brooks family's reputation." Henry's face remained neutral, though inside, the words were a cold comfort. He wasn't here for justice alone. He was here to make them pay, to watch the collapse of everything they had tried to take from him. "Perfect," he said softly, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'll just follow precedent." Franklin raised an eyebrow. "You're sure you want to take this all the way, Henry? Once it's out, it's going to be a mess. And your son—" "I'm sure," Henry interrupted, his voice hardening. "There's no turning back now. If they think they can get away with this, they're mistaken." They spent the next several hours going over the details, preparing legal filings and compiling the evidence. Every move was calculated, every document organized. They were building the foundation of a case that would bring everything to a standstill. Outside, the evening sun began to fade, casting long shadows across the floor of Henry's office. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the room as Franklin finalized the last of the legal paperwork. Henry's mind was already several steps ahead, thinking of what came next. He had always been prepared for this moment. His calm demeanor was not born of fear, but of control, the kind of control he had learned through decades of working in finance. This was no different. Martha had been quiet for the last few days. She could sense the tension in the air, though Henry had said little to her about the details. He didn't want her worried, didn't want her to feel the weight of the storm that was coming. But he knew she would feel it soon enough, whether he spoke of it or not. He left the office that night, the paperwork safely tucked away in his briefcase, and drove home in the quiet, the streetlights flickering as he passed. He could feel the pressure building, the storm gathering in the distance. Inside, Martha was reading in the living room, her eyes flicking up when he entered. She said nothing, but there was something in the air between them, a silent understanding, a knowing that this battle had only just begun. As Henry set down his briefcase and looked out the window, the final pieces of the puzzle fell into place. The countdown had begun. They were on the brink of something much larger than they realized, and when the time came, there would be no stopping it. The phone call came while Paula was in the middle of a fitting for a new dress. Something sleek, something that would accentuate the right angles, make her look like she belonged. She was still adjusting her earrings when the phone rang, its shrill tone cutting through the air like a jolt of lightning. She didn't recognize the number, but something told her it was important. Maybe it was instinct, maybe the growing unease that had been creeping up her spine ever since that morning. She pressed the phone to her ear, her voice cool but distracted. "Hello? Ms. Brooks?" a voice on the other end asked. "This is Emily Roberts from Walker & Sons Realty. I'm calling with an urgent update on the property sale of 211 Elm Street. It's been frozen pending further investigation." Paula froze, her fingers tightening around the phone. She blinked once, twice, as though the words hadn't quite settled in her mind. Frozen, she repeated, her voice suddenly cold, edged with disbelief. What do you mean frozen? There are irregularities in the documentation, the voice explained, clipped, formal. We've received a notice of potential fraud regarding the co-signers on the mortgage. The sale will be on hold until the matter is resolved. Paula's hand trembled, and she took a sharp breath. Her vision blurred for a moment, a mix of confusion and anger clouding her thoughts. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to be done with it. It was supposed to be easy. Do you have any idea what this means for the sale? She asked, trying to sound composed, though the panic was beginning to rise in her chest. I'm afraid it means everything is on hold, Ms. Brooks. The buyers have been informed, and the sale is suspended until further notice. We'll keep you updated, but you may need to contact your legal counsel. The call ended abruptly, and for a moment, all Paula could do was stare at the phone in her hand. The world outside seemed to blur, frozen. The sale, the house, her plans, her future, slipping out of her grasp like sand in the wind. Without another thought, she dropped the phone onto the couch and rushed out of the room. She didn't bother with her shoes, just dashed barefoot down the hall, her heart pounding in her chest. Henry. The front door slammed open as she ran out, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She wasn't sure what she expected when she arrived home. A confrontation, a resolution, maybe something to explain the mess she'd just learned about. But Henry sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee, completely calm. He didn't even look up when she stormed through the door, her eyes wild. You knew, she hissed, her voice trembling with fury. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't even move his head. He simply lowered the mug and set it down on the table. His voice was calm, almost bored. Of course, he said, his tone cold as ice. I own the place. For a moment, Paula was speechless. The words echoed in her mind, bouncing off the walls of the small kitchen. I own the place. It was a fact she hadn't considered, or perhaps had chosen not to. All this time, she had assumed the house was as good as sold. In her mind, it was already hers, the inheritance, the future. Don't act like you don't understand what this means, she spat, her voice rising with the heat of her panic. She took a step forward, her hands shaking. You can't just stop the sale, Henry. You can't ruin everything for us. Henry's eyes finally met hers. His expression didn't change, but the weight of his gaze seemed to draw the breath from her lungs. Ruin, he repeated as though testing the word. I'm not ruining anything. You're the one who tried to steal from me. She stepped back, the words hitting her harder than she was ready for. Her thoughts were scattered now, bouncing from one panic-stricken thought to the next. The house is frozen. The sale is off. What happens to their plans? What happens to her future? Her phone rang again, cutting through the silence like a blade. Without looking, she answered. Victor. Victor's voice came through loud and clear, even from across the room. Don't talk to him, he ordered, his voice thick with urgency. We'll handle this. Don't engage with him. Henry's lips twitched into a small, knowing smile. He didn't respond to Victor directly, but instead turned his eyes back to Paula. She already did, he said softly, his tone carrying a weight that made Paula's stomach churn. The tension in the room was suffocating. Paula stood frozen, her hands clenching and unclenching, her heart hammering in her chest. For the first time, she saw Henry differently. The man she thought she could control, the man she thought would bend to the will of her and her family, was staring back at her with something colder, something calculated. Victor's voice cut through the thick silence again. You can't do this, Henry. You're making a mistake. You'll regret it. Henry didn't answer. He didn't need to. The coldness in his eyes said everything. The line had been drawn. The camera would linger on Paula's face now, her expression shifting from rage to realization, her body trembling as the truth settled in. She had underestimated him, and as the camera pulled back, the weight of that realization, of the consequences, sank in. There was no going back from this. The doorbell rang in the stillness of the house, its chime cutting through the afternoon air like a sharp reminder of the world outside. Henry looked up from his desk, his eyes narrowing slightly as he rose from his chair. Franklin Reese stood on the other side of the door, a briefcase in hand. his face calm but heavy with unspoken things. "Martha," Henry called softly as he walked toward the door, his voice a low murmur. "Franklin's here." Martha didn't respond immediately, but Henry knew she'd heard him. She had been in the kitchen, her hands moving automatically as she prepared their usual lunch. It was a routine she'd held on to tightly, a comfort in the midst of everything unraveling around them. Franklin stepped inside, his polished shoes tapping against the hardwood floor. He nodded at Henry, his expression serious. "Got the papers, Henry. These need your signature before we proceed." Henry nodded, accepting the papers from Franklin's hand, but as his eyes scanned over the documents, his thoughts were far from the legal jargon in front of him. Martha was still in the kitchen, and he hadn't yet told her the full extent of what was happening. It wasn't that he wanted to keep secrets, it was just safer this way. She didn't need the weight of it. But as Franklin stepped into the room, he glanced at the kitchen door. And that was all it took. Martha had been listening. She stood at the entrance of the kitchen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face pale. She hadn't meant to overhear, but the words were impossible to miss. She had always prided herself on being attuned to the quiet moments, the ones where emotions were carried in looks and pauses instead of spoken aloud. "So, you've been planning this?" Her voice trembled as she asked the question. The words stung more than he expected. Henry didn't look up immediately. His focus remained on the papers in front of him, the signature waiting. But he knew she was standing there, the silence stretching between them like a canyon that neither of them had expected to cross. Finally, he set the papers down and turned to face her. There was no anger in his eyes, no regret, just the quiet calm of a man who had made a decision, a man who knew the road ahead was already set. "You wanted me to let it go," he said, his voice measured, low. "I did, to the lawyer." Martha's face shifted, her lips trembling as she absorbed his words. The weight of them settled on her, the realization that Henry hadn't been passive, hadn't simply stood by and let things happen. He had been in control all along. But how much control had he truly given up? She had always seen him as calm, even-tempered, but this side of him was something she had never truly understood. And now, she saw it for what it was, a quiet determination, a plan that had been set into motion long before she ever realized. Her eyes filled with tears, but these weren't the same tears from before. This time, there was no fear in her heart, no trembling at the thought of losing everything. It was something different, something heavier, yet somehow more tender. Pride. She took a step toward him, the weight of the moment pressing on her chest. "You're teaching them, aren't you?" she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. Henry looked at her then, his expression softening just enough for her to see the vulnerability beneath his calm exterior. "Lesson 1, he said, his voice barely audible. "Don't steal from a man who balanced ledgers." Martha's tears fell now, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were something deeper, more complex. She reached out slowly, her hand resting lightly on Henry's arm. The gesture was simple but spoke volumes. She had been afraid of losing him, of losing the foundation they had built. But now, she saw him for who he really was. Not just the man who had worked tirelessly to provide, but the man who would fight for what mattered. Franklin cleared his throat softly from behind them, his presence still lingering in the room, but he knew better than to interrupt. This was a conversation for them alone. Martha finally looked up at Henry, her hands trembling as they moved to his chest, as if she needed to ground herself in the man standing before her. "I didn't know," she whispered, her voice shaking. "I didn't know you were planning this all along." Henry wrapped his hand gently around hers, his grip steady, reassuring. "I didn't want to involve you, Martha," he said quietly. This was never about you. But you deserve to know now. You deserve to know what they've done, what they're still trying to do." Martha nodded slowly, wiping the tears from her eyes. She could see now, see the weight of it all, the betrayal, the loss, the struggle. But she could also see the strength in him, the strength that she had always admired, but never fully understood. And in that moment, as their eyes met, the understanding passed between them, unspoken, but felt deeply. They had always been a team, and this was no different. No matter how deep the betrayal ran, no matter how much was lost, they would face it together. The room fell into a quiet, tender silence. Franklin glanced between them, knowing his presence was no longer necessary. He turned, collecting his papers, giving them a moment of peace. He had done his part. Now it was up to Henry and Martha to decide how far they would go. As the door clicked softly behind Franklin, the house seemed to hold its breath. The game had changed, and the stakes had risen. The countdown had begun, and there was no turning back. The morning was quiet, the kind of peaceful stillness that comes just before the storm. The sun filtered through the window, casting long shadows across the kitchen as Henry sat at the table sipping his coffee. His fingers traced the edge of his mug, but his mind was elsewhere, moving through the plans he had set in motion. Everything had been calculated down to the smallest detail, and now the pieces were falling into place. A knock at the door shattered the calm. Henry didn't flinch. He didn't need to. He knew exactly who it was. The sound of boots on the front porch followed, the sharp rap of the doorbell, and then a voice calling from outside. "Sheriff's office, Mr. Cole." Henry set his mug down slowly, his expression unreadable. He didn't stand immediately. He let the silence hang, just long enough for the message to sink in. He had anticipated this moment, but still, the weight of it hung in the air, like the first crack of thunder before the storm. "Martha," he said quietly, his voice steady. "You might want to sit down." Martha, who had been moving between the stove and the sink, turned slowly. Her face was pale, her brow furrowed in confusion, but she said nothing as Henry rose from his chair and walked to the door. He opened it to find the sheriff, a tall man with graying hair and a stern expression, standing on the porch with a folded piece of paper in his hands. "Mr. Cole," the sheriff said, his voice formal but laced with sympathy, "I have a legal notice for the Brooks family. It's official. Their assets are being seized, pending a full investigation into fraudulent property transactions." Henry didn't need to look at the paper to know what it was. He'd seen these documents before. "I see," he said simply. The sheriff held out the notice, his eyes briefly flicking to Henry. "I've been instructed to serve this directly to the Brookses. It's a state matter now. We're also reviewing other properties they own for irregularities." "Thank you," Henry said, taking the notice from the sheriff's hand. He didn't look up, but the weight of the document in his hand felt heavier than anything he had ever held before. He wasn't angry. He wasn't relieved. He was simply resolute. The pieces had been put into place, and now they would fall as they would. The sheriff nodded, tipping his hat before turning and walking down the porch steps, his boots fading with each step. Henry stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring down at the paper in his hand. He could hear Martha's footsteps behind him, her quiet presence filling the space. "You knew this was coming, didn't you?" she asked softly, her voice strained with something between dread and disbelief. Henry nodded once, his eyes focused on the notice. "I did." Martha's gaze shifted, following the sheriff's retreating form, before her eyes settled back on Henry. "So, this is it. It's all out in the open now." Before Henry could answer, the sound of a car screeching to a halt broke the tension in the air. They both turned to see a car pulling into the driveway, Victor's. His sleek, black sedan came to a halt, and the door swung open almost violently. David stormed out of the vehicle, his face red with fury, his fists clenched at his sides. David rushed up the steps to the front door, his breath coming in sharp bursts. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice cracking with the pressure of something he couldn't quite control. "What the hell's going on? Why is the house being seized?" Henry didn't flinch. He simply looked at his son, his eyes as steady as ever. "It's called consequence, David," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You can't steal from people without paying for it." David's eyes widened as the realization settled over him. His face turned pale, his lips trembling as the weight of the words sank in. "No," he whispered, the denial barely audible. This is about me, isn't it? About my mistakes?" Martha stepped forward now, her voice shaking as she reached out to David. "David, But before she could finish, the sound of a scream interrupted her. Paula had burst out from the house, her face contorted in anger and panic. "He ruined us," she screamed, her hands flailing in the air as she rushed toward Henry. "You did this, Henry. You think you've won, but you've destroyed everything." David's eyes shifted between Paula and Henry, the pieces finally clicking into place. His jaw tightened, and for the first time, he looked fully aware of the gravity of the situation. "No," he muttered to himself, his voice breaking. "No, I ruined me." The words were like a knife, carving through the tension that had been building all day. Paula's anger seemed to drain from her for a moment, her face paling as she realized the truth of what David had just said. He had never fully understood what was at stake, what he was playing with, and now it was too late to take any of it back. Meanwhile, Henry stood in the doorway, unmoving, his face unreadable. The storm had come, and now he was simply waiting for the rain to pass. He turned slowly, his gaze softening for just a moment as he looked at Martha. "Funny," he said quietly, almost as if speaking to himself, "how fast roots die without water." Martha didn't answer immediately, but her gaze followed Henry as he stepped back into the house, his footsteps measured, steady. The storm outside had nothing on the one that was brewing within. As the door closed behind him, Paula's panicked breathing filled the silence. Inside the house, Henry moved to the window, the weight of everything pressing down on him. And still, he felt no relief. The battle was far from over. The courtroom was small, cramped even, with old wooden pews that creaked under the weight of tension. The air inside was thick with the hum of anxious whispers and the scent of paper, ink, and cold stone. It was an unusual setting for a case that had captured public interest, yet the stakes felt as high as they could be. Spectators filled the seats, some out of curiosity, others out of necessity. For some, it was just another case. For Henry, it was everything. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his posture straight, his hands folded in his lap. His eyes were calm, watching the proceedings without expression. The room felt cold, despite the warmth of bodies packed close together. The trial had begun. Victor Brooks stood at the front, his tailored suit a perfect match for the arrogance that radiated from him. He adjusted his cufflinks, a movement so practiced, so controlled, it might have been part of some pre-rehearsed act. When he turned toward the judge, his smile was wide, a charm that had worked for him so many times before. But today, the judge, an older man with a stern brow and cold eyes, wasn't buying it. "Your Honor," Victor began, stepping toward the bench with his usual confidence, "I trust we can expedite this matter. The Cole family has—" The judge raised a hand, his voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Mr. Brooks, I'm aware of the circumstances. I'm aware of your reputation." Victor faltered slightly. The comment wasn't an insult, but it was enough to unsettle him. He smiled again, but it was thinner now, less convincing. "Of course, but I assure you, this case is a misunderstanding." The judge's gaze didn't soften. "We'll see about that." He glanced down at the file in front of him, flipping it open with a quick flick of his wrist. "Proceed, Mr. Reese." Henry's lawyer, Franklin Reese, stood up from his seat, his movements deliberate. Franklin had been Henry's closest confidant, his old friend from the bank, the kind of man who knew how to build a case quietly, methodically. The jury, though mostly neutral, couldn't escape the way Franklin commanded the room with his silent authority. Franklin approached the front, papers in hand. He didn't waste time with niceties. He opened the briefcase, pulled out the documents, and placed them in front of the judge. The audience held its breath. The truth was about to unfold. "Your Honor," Franklin began, his voice measured, clear. "The evidence here is irrefutable. This is the forged deed that my client, Mr. Henry Cole, discovered, a transfer of property made under fraudulent circumstances. The signatures, both digital and written, have been traced. Mr. Cole's signature was forged. I have documentation here that proves this was done with the intent to deceive." He slid the digital trail evidence toward the judge, a chart detailing the timestamps, the IP addresses, and the signature files. The room grew silent. Franklin didn't need to say much more. The evidence spoke for itself. Victor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his earlier confidence slipping away like sand through his fingers. His eyes darted nervously toward his attorney, but no help came. The The tide had turned, and there was no reversing it now. The judge looked over the evidence, his expression hardening as he absorbed the details. He glanced up at Franklin, then down again at the trail of data. After a long pause, he spoke. The evidence is clear. The signatures were forged, and the property transfer was carried out under fraudulent pretenses. This court will consider the case of property fraud closed. The deeds are hereby reverted to their original owner, Mr. Henry Cole. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It was over, and the words felt like a heavy weight lifting off Henry's shoulders. He didn't smile, didn't nod in satisfaction. He remained seated, his eyes still focused, his body still. Victor, on the other hand, was visibly shaking now, his face flushed with embarrassment, his mouth twitching, as though he couldn't believe the verdict. He stood up, but there was no composure in his movements. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything to hold on to. The judge continued, his voice cold. Victor Brooks, this court finds you guilty of fraud and manipulation. You will be fined heavily for your actions. Victor's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but nothing came out. He looked down, as if searching for a way to salvage the pieces of his pride, but there was nothing left to save. David, sitting at the back, slumped in his seat. His shoulders were heavy with the weight of the judgment. He hadn't spoken throughout the trial, his eyes vacant, his hands clenched in his lap. He had known the consequences were coming, but hearing them confirmed hit him with the force of a wave. He was collateral damage. A pawn in a game he hadn't even understood until it was too late. The judge's voice broke through the stillness. As for David Brooks, the court orders that his loan privileges be revoked. He will no longer be eligible for any financial dealings under the state. David's face flushed a deep shade of red, his jaw clenched as his world crumbled around him. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. Franklin stood tall, his job done. His face was impassive, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of quiet satisfaction. Henry stood slowly, the quiet dignity of the moment settling over him. He wasn't celebrating, but neither was he mourning. This was the cost of betrayal, and now it was paid. As the courtroom emptied, the snow outside began to fall, slow and steady, the flakes drifting gently to the ground. It was a quiet, peaceful end to a storm that had raged for so long. Henry walked out into the winter air, his face calm, his steps measured. He didn't look back. There was nothing left to say, no words left to be spoken. The victory was his, but the cost would echo far beyond the walls of this courtroom. Funny, Henry said softly, almost to himself, as he turned toward the quiet, cold world outside. How fast roots die without water. And with that, the last piece fell into place. The house was quieter now. The echoes of the chaos, the threats, the lies, the betrayals, had faded, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost foreign. Henry moved through the rooms, methodical, the quiet hum of his footsteps the only sound. He'd always been a man of precision, of action taken with calm deliberation, and today was no different. Each door he passed, he rekeyed with careful hands, the old keys slipping easily into the locks, the metal turning with a satisfying click. It was a small, almost insignificant act, but for Henry, it was the first tangible step in reclaiming what had always been his. The rooms had changed too. The walls, once chipped and cracked from years of wear, now gleamed with fresh coats of paint. The smell of fresh primer and glossy finish filled the air, a stark contrast to the acrid scent of betrayal that had lingered just a few weeks ago. It wasn't just the house that was being renewed. It was everything, the foundation, the trust, the years of memories that had been tainted by greed. But now it was his again, his home, his sanctuary. Downstairs, Martha moved through the living room with a renewed sense of purpose. The shelves were carefully arranged once more, her hands smoothing the edges of the photos, placing each item with a tenderness that spoke volumes. She decorated modestly now, a few family photos, the soft glow of candles in the window. No more extravagant displays, no need to impress. The warmth returned to the room, a quiet comfort that had been missing for too long. Henry paused at the doorway, watching her. There was a softness in her movements, a gentleness that only came when the weight of uncertainty had lifted. He knew it wasn't just the house she was reclaiming. It was the peace she had lost. The fear had been replaced by something steadier, by trust. Martha looked up, catching Henry's gaze from across the room. She smiled, a slow, quiet thing, but in it was everything he needed. A promise that they had weathered the storm. They had come through it, and now it was theirs again. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence, and Henry turned, his expression steady. He wasn't surprised. The visitor was expected, though not by Martha. Claire stepped inside, the door creaking softly behind her. Her presence was calm but assertive, her movements purposeful. She held a folder in her hands, the edges worn from use. "Martha," Claire greeted warmly, her eyes flicking to Henry for a moment before returning to her mother. "How are you?" Martha smiled faintly, brushing a hand across her cheek. "Better," she said simply. "Everything feels different now." Claire nodded, her gaze shifting to Henry. "I brought the trust papers," she said, her voice quieter now, "for the house. I think it's time we make it official." Henry glanced at the folder she held. He didn't need to ask what it was. It was the same paperwork that had been discussed over the past few days, the one that would secure Martha's place here, the one that would guarantee the home passed down in a way that meant something. Not as an inheritance built on greed, but on respect. He took the papers from Claire's hands, the weight of them more symbolic than anything. His fingers traced the signature line, pausing for a moment. This wasn't just about the house. It was about everything that came with it. His years of work, his legacy, his choice to rebuild after everything had been stripped away. "Cole family home," Henry read aloud, his voice steady. Martha and Claire's name jointly. Claire watched him closely, as if waiting for something. He looked up from the paper, meeting her eyes for the first time. "Let legacy skip a generation this time," Henry said softly, almost to himself. It wasn't just a statement, it was a choice. A conscious decision to leave behind the past, to make room for something new, to stop the cycle of ownership and control and pass on something of real value, security, peace, and the knowledge that the home would always belong to those who truly cherished it. Martha stepped forward now, placing a hand on Henry's arm. She didn't say anything, but her eyes spoke more than words ever could. She understood. This was about more than just signatures on paper. It was about reclaiming something that was theirs, together. Henry signed the papers with a quiet finality. The ink flowed smoothly across the page, but the act itself felt like a turning point. For the first time in a long while, he felt the weight of years lift, not in exhaustion, but in accomplishment. The storm had passed. As he finished, Henry closed the folder and looked up at his family. Claire smiled softly, but it was Martha who reached out, her hand warm on his shoulder. "Thank you," she said simply, her voice thick with emotion. Henry didn't need to reply. His eyes were enough. There was no need for words anymore. They had weathered the storm, and now the house was theirs again, the family's. Not just a property, but a home. The camera held on Henry's face for a long moment, capturing the contentment in his eyes, the quiet satisfaction of a man who had fought and won, not with brute force, but with patience, with precision, with determination. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about peace. Outside, the snow began to fall, soft and steady, as though the world itself had exhaled in relief. And as Henry turned toward the door, he closed it behind him with a soft, deliberate motion. The sound of the latch clicking shut was louder than it seemed. For the first time, it truly felt safe. The letter arrived in the morning, the kind of heavy silence that filled the room before it was even opened. David stared at it, his name printed in bold, stark letters across the top, the official seal of the bank staring back at him. The envelope was thick, too thick for a simple notice, and his fingers trembled slightly as he tore it open. Inside, the words were clear, unmistakable. "This is to inform you that due to unpaid debts, and failure to meet required payment deadlines, your mortgage is being foreclosed. You are hereby required to vacate the premises immediately." David's breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the room around him seemed to blur. The walls felt too close, the air too thick, as if everything he had worked for, or thought he had worked for, was crumbling in an instant. His palms went clammy, and his mind raced. How could this be happening? This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had been so sure that he'd fixed everything. He had been so confident when he'd signed those papers, convinced that Victor's connections would pull them through. Paula came into the room, her heels clicking sharply against the floor. She didn't ask what the letter was. She could see it in his face. She crossed the room quickly, her eyes scanning the notice before she spoke, her voice a mixture of disbelief and fury. "You did this, David," she hissed. "You ruined us." Her voice shook with a mix of panic and anger, but there was no tenderness in it. Only the cold sting of blame. David looked up at her, the weight of her accusation like a physical blow. His mind raced, trying to process what had just happened, and still all he could feel was the crushing weight of failure. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking as he turned toward her. "I didn't know," Paula snapped, cutting him off, her hands thrown up in frustration. "You didn't know? You didn't ask? What were you doing, David? Just letting Victor handle it? Letting him destroy us?" She paced in a tight circle, her mind already leaping to the worst conclusions. "This was your responsibility, not his. We were supposed to be fine. Now look at us. We're losing everything." David could barely look her in the eye. She was right, in a way. He had let things spiral, assuming the situation would resolve itself, always deferring to Victor's charm and his promises. But it was his name on the paperwork, his failure, his mistakes. I don't know what to do," he whispered, feeling the last bit of control slipping through his fingers. Paula's eyes narrowed, her expression a storm of fury and helplessness. "Don't come near me with your excuses, David." Victor's voice had been absent in the chaos. His calls had gone unanswered, his messages unread. David had tried reaching him in desperation, but the silence from Victor was deafening. Not even a single return message. His father-in-law had slipped away without a trace, leaving David to face the wreckage alone. The hours dragged on in a haze of dread, and by late afternoon, David couldn't sit still anymore. He couldn't breathe in the house that no longer felt like his own. The walls closed in, the looming sense of doom too heavy to ignore. Finally, without a word to Paula, he grabbed his coat and walked out the door. He needed to do something, to fix it, to plead for mercy, for anything that might save him from this spiral. He didn't know if it would help, but he had one place left to go. One person who might still listen, despite everything. He drove through the streets, the car's tires hitting the pavement with a dull, rhythmic thrum. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles went white. The sky outside was heavy, gray clouds rolling in like a storm that had already passed, but left its damage in its wake. It was a storm of his own making, and now he had nowhere to turn but the one place he never wanted to return to. Henry's house loomed ahead, a quiet reminder of what he had once taken for granted, the man who had been there for him, the father figure who had never been afraid to hold him accountable. The house that he had once thought he'd be taking over, but now seemed like a place too far out of reach. David parked in the driveway, the engine purring to a stop. He got out of the car, his movements robotic, his breath shallow. His legs felt heavy as he walked up the porch steps, and when he knocked on the door, his heart pounded like a drumbeat in his chest. The door opened slowly, just enough to reveal Henry standing in the doorway, his face calm, his eyes unreadable. "Help me, Dad," David's voice cracked as he spoke the words, the desperation leaking through the cracks he had so carefully built up around himself. "I don't know what to do. Please." Henry didn't speak immediately. He just stood there, his eyes scanning David for a long, quiet moment. His expression never changed, his posture never shifted. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Henry spoke. His voice was soft, but firm. "I did," he said, his words measured, deliberate. "I taught you what happens when you laugh at the wrong man." David's mouth went dry. The words hit him like a slap, his eyes widening as he realized the depth of the consequences, the truth of Henry's statement. It was all so clear now. Henry had warned him, had shown him what could happen when trust was misplaced, when arrogance took the place of humility. Without another word, Henry slowly closed the door, his face still unreadable. The sound of the latch clicking shut felt like a finality, a weight that crushed everything David had hoped for. Outside, the wind picked up, the chill of the evening air cutting through him. David stood motionless for a moment, his breath fogging in the cold. And as the last trace of warmth left the porch, the door remained closed, leaving him standing alone, a man whose mistakes had finally caught up to him. Months passed, the world outside Henry's home shifting with the changing seasons. The harshness of winter had given way to the softness of spring, and with it, the quiet settling of things that had once seemed impossible to repair. The news cycle, which had once circled the Cole family's private battles like vultures, had long since moved on to fresher stories. The Elder fraud case, as it had been labeled, had ended in a verdict of poetic justice, the weight of its consequences rippling through the Brooks family's reputation and beyond. The headlines were still easy to find, tucked away in local news archives. Cole family reclaims home in fraud case. Victor Brooks fined, assets frozen. But for Henry and Martha, the real victory lay not in the papers, but in the quiet that followed. There was peace now, a peace that had felt impossible only months ago, and it was one they had earned, not just through legal victories, but through their resolve, through their refusal to bend when the world tried to break them. The small church luncheon they hosted that afternoon was a far cry from the chaos that had once threatened to tear everything apart. The long wooden tables were lined with simple dishes, homemade bread, hearty soup, fresh fruit. There was a soft hum of conversation in the room, the low murmur of familiar voices, of neighbors and friends who had stood by them through it all. The air smelled of roasted vegetables and warm pastries, the kind of comfort food that spoke to the soul. Martha moved through the room with a quiet grace, placing dishes in front of guests with her usual care. She smiled as she greeted them, her movements a dance she had perfected over the years, one born of love and patience. It was a dance she hadn't been able to perform in the same way before. But now, as she looked around the room, the weight of the past seemed to lift, and the light in her eyes had returned. Henry stood at the head of the room, his posture relaxed, a content smile on his face as he greeted friends and neighbors. The man who had once been the pillar of strength in his family, the man who had stood firm in the face of betrayal and loss, now wore the peace of someone who had fought, not just for a house, but for something far deeper. The pastor of their church, a kind man with a voice that carried warmth like a blanket, stood beside Henry as he spoke to the gathered crowd. "Henry," the pastor said, his words gentle but full of conviction, "you fought for what was right, not with anger, but with integrity. That's what this community will remember. Your example, your strength. It will echo for years to come." Henry's smile deepened, but there was no arrogance in it, no pride, just a quiet, humble understanding of the truth in those words. He looked at the pastor, his gaze steady. "Anger's noisy," he said, his voice low but clear. "Integrity echoes longer." The pastor nodded, the faintest trace of approval in his eyes. The small crowd of churchgoers nodded with him, murmuring their agreement. The applause that followed was gentle, respectful. It wasn't the applause of victory in the traditional sense. It wasn't loud or boisterous. It was the quiet acknowledgement of a man who had fought a battle that wasn't won with fists, but with patience, strategy, and calm resolve. As the last notes of applause faded, Henry turned toward Martha, whose eyes had never left him. He reached out, his hand brushing against hers. She smiled at him, a small, tender smile, the kind of smile that only came after everything had been rebuilt, after the scars had begun to fade. They didn't speak, but in that silence, everything was understood. They had weathered the storm, and now they stood in the sunlight. The sunlight, too, had changed. It poured through the windows, casting long beams across the room. The same light that had once illuminated the coldness of betrayal now filled the house with a warmth that felt like a rebirth. The room, which had once echoed with the sharpness of laughter that wasn't theirs to enjoy, now felt full of something different. Peace. It was the same room where everything had broken down. The same walls that had witnessed every argument, every tear shed in fear and frustration. But now, as sunlight bathed the room, it was transformed. The silence felt full of possibility. Martha moved to the window, her fingers tracing the edge of the curtain, and for a moment she looked out. The garden, once neglected, was now blooming with life. Vibrant colors, flowers that had been tended to, nurtured. It was a metaphor too clear to ignore. The storm had passed, and now the seeds of something new were taking root. Henry joined her at the window, standing behind her with a quiet strength. Together, they watched the garden, the sunlight streaming through the glass, the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The house was still theirs, not just the walls, but the home they had rebuilt. The same home that had once felt like a trap, a place of conflict and uncertainty, now felt like a sanctuary again. For the first time in what seemed like ages, Henry breathed out fully, deeply, the weight of the past lifted. It was over, and in its place, there was nothing but quiet peace. The camera lingers on them, standing together in the sunlight, the warmth of the room filling the space. The peaceful silence that follows is heavy with everything they've overcome, and for the first time in months, the door closes behind them. But this time, it feels different. This time, it truly feels safe. The sun had barely crept over the horizon when Claire arrived, a paint can in one hand and a brush in the other, her expression calm but purposeful. The living room, once muted with the weight of old memories, was now transformed. The faint smell of fresh paint filled the air, mingling with the earthy scent of the flowers Ellie had brought just minutes before, their soft petals adding a touch of color to the room's newly revitalized walls. Ellie's arrival had been an unspoken gesture of solidarity, of family that had weathered storms together. Claire dipped her brush into the can, the bristles carrying a new shade of warmth as she began to work. The walls, which had once been a dull, lifeless beige, now gleamed with a soft, golden hue, a shade that caught the light in a way that made everything feel open, welcoming, alive again. Martha watched from the corner, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, her gaze fixed on Claire's steady movements. The tension that had once settled between the walls was slowly fading, replaced by something simpler, something enduring. Henry stood by the window, looking out at the front yard. There was a stillness in him, a quiet determination. He had already planted the first tree that morning. A young oak, its branches still thin but full of potential. A symbol, he thought, of the life they were rebuilding. A home that would stand for years, long after the shadows of the past had faded away. Martha's voice broke through the silence. She had come up beside him, leaning gently against the window frame, her eyes tracing the edges of the yard where the freshly planted trees now stood. There was an unspoken heaviness in her gaze, a lingering worry that refused to leave her entirely. "You think David will ever come around?" she asked, her voice soft, but thick with concern. Henry's hands rested on the windowsill, his back straight as he turned to face her. He had never been the type to express fear. Even now, there was a quiet strength in his demeanor, but the question held a complexity he couldn't easily ignore. "He will," Henry said, his voice steady, though there was a quiet resolve beneath it. "When he finds a home no one can steal." Martha didn't respond immediately. She simply watched him, her face reflecting the exhaustion of years lived in uncertainty. She didn't need to say more. They both knew what had been lost, and what might still be. The betrayal had hurt them both, but Henry's words were a reminder that they could still rebuild, that no matter what, they had something that couldn't be taken away. Henry reached out then, his hand finding Martha's. It was a simple gesture, but it was everything they had. They had fought together side by side through the storm that had nearly shattered their lives, and now they had peace. The simple act of holding hands in that quiet room was a promise that they would face whatever came next together. The world outside, with all its chaos and noise, could wait. They had found their sanctuary. A pair of birds landed on the newly planted oak tree, their wings fluttering gently as they perched on the fresh branches. Their song filled the air, a soft and melodic reminder that life continued, that even after the hardest winters, spring would always come. It was a symbolic renewal, the bird's call echoing through the stillness of the yard, underscoring the shift that had taken place in their lives. Martha smiled faintly, her eyes meeting Henry's. There was no more bitterness between them, no more fear of what the future might hold. They had their home. They had each other. And together, they would rebuild whatever else was needed. Henry squeezed her hand gently before turning back to the window, watching the birds disappear into the sky. He didn't say anything else. There was no need. Everything had been said in that quiet, unspoken moment. The camera would pull back slowly then, capturing the image of Henry and Martha standing together in the doorway of their home, the light of the late afternoon sun warming the room behind them. The porch was peaceful now, no longer marked by the tension of past betrayals, but filled instead with the quiet hum of new life, both in the garden and in their hearts. The bird's song drifted on the wind, and the camera panned from the porch, lifting toward the bright skyline beyond, where the last rays of the sun caught the edges of the trees and the sky seemed endless. In the distance, the city continued on, unchanged, but here, in this quiet corner of the world, Henry and Martha had finally found what they needed most: peace. The office was dim, the only light coming from the soft glow of the desk lamp. Henry sat quietly, his fingers tracing the edges of the final pages of his journal. The room around him was still, filled with the faint scent of leather and ink, the weight of years wrapped in the quiet solitude he had grown accustomed to. His mind was quiet now, focused only on the task at hand. There was no rush, no lingering anger. This was the end of something, the final step. He flipped the last page, the pen in his hand, moving with a steady rhythm as he wrote the final words: forgiveness paid in full. The phrase came to him easily, but it felt heavier than he expected. Forgiveness, a word that had once seemed so distant, now neatly tied to everything he had worked for, fought for. It wasn't the forgiveness that was owed to him, but the one he had granted. He had not forgiven the past, nor had he forgotten, but the price had been paid. With a final flourish, he closed the journal, the soft leather cover folding shut with a satisfying snap. The weight of the book in his hands was now lessened, the burden of the past at last put to rest. He placed it beside the family photo on the desk, the picture of Martha, Claire, and himself, their smiles a quiet reminder of what he had been fighting for all along. The house, the home, the legacy. Henry sat back in his chair for a moment, letting the stillness of the room wash over him. His eyes lingered on the photo, the memories flooding back in quiet waves. The days before the betrayal, before the storm had hit, felt like another life, one he would never return to. But he had learned something valuable from it all, not just about others, but about himself. He had learned that strength wasn't found in loud gestures, in grand declarations of victory. It was found in silence, in patience, in the quiet, methodical work that only the truly resolute could endure. He reached for the lamp, turning it off with a soft click, and for a moment, the room was completely dark. He stood slowly, his gaze drifting to the living room, where the light still burned softly. He left the office, his footsteps quiet against the wooden floor, and as he passed through the doorway, he glanced once more at the journal on the desk, now closed for good. The living room was warm, the soft glow of the light casting gentle shadows across the walls. The house felt different now. It wasn't just the paint on the walls or the new trees in the yard. It was the peace that had settled in, the kind of peace that came after a storm had passed and the world had finally calmed. Henry stood in the doorway of the living room, his eyes taking in the quiet. He had reclaimed everything. The house was his, not because it had been legally returned, but because he had held onto it in a way that no one else could. He had protected it, fought for it, and in the end, he had let go of everything that tried to destroy it. They laughed in my home once. Henry's voice echoed through the silence, low and steady, as though speaking to himself. Now they only echo in memory. The words were a quiet reflection, a final acceptance of everything that had transpired. The laughter that had once filled this place, the mockery, the betrayal. It no longer had a place here. Now, the house was a sanctuary, not because of what had happened, but because of what had been rebuilt. The camera lingered for a moment on Henry's face, his expression calm, his eyes distant, as though he were still processing the weight of the journey he had completed. Then, slowly, his gaze shifted toward the family photo on the mantel, the faintest trace of a smile tugging at his lips. He turned, walking toward the door to the porch, the light from the living room casting a soft glow across the floor. The night outside was peaceful now, the distant sound of birds settling for the evening filling the quiet. As Henry stepped onto the porch, the camera pulled back, capturing the serene stillness of the house, the place he had fought so hard to keep. The birds had stopped singing, but the calm was heavy with everything that had been restored. And as the camera panned upward, catching the first stars twinkling in the night sky, the screen slowly faded to black. He didn't shout. He calculated.